our brand new studio.
In times of uncertainty, we shouldn't be making promises that we cannot keep. Instead of focusing on the future, we should focus on the here and the now. 12 teams, all best of threes, double elimination, $1 million. Welcome to Flashpoint.
Welcome to Flashpoint 2. Here we are in Twickenham at the lovely rugby stadium here. But instead of the usual scrum of sweaty men, we instead have some, I guess, pretty cool talent here on broadcast. Joining me here for Get to the Point will be Thorin and Alan to start off our matches today. How are you gentlemen doing?
It's a pleasure to be here in a truly historic sports stadium like Twickenham, because esports often was consigned to small, like 80s gymnastics arenas in Poland.
Wow.
Well, it feels great for me to be here. I'll just go for a normal intro.
I was a very Flashpoint start to things, pulling no punches, of course. And so now we are going to start talking through our various groups that we are going to be playing under. We do have 12 teams here, all competing for that $1 million prize. Very, very exciting. It's our biggest prize of the year in CSGO. In fact, the top 2 prize pool tournaments so far are as follows. Flashpoint 1 and now Flashpoint 2. With no majors, we're here and we will be giving out $1 million divided among these teams, $500,000 to first place. So very good stuff. As we head into the start of this tournament, you are going to be looking at our format here. We have our 7 Flashpoint partner teams joined by 3 invited teams this time around. Those are FNATIC, Big, and OG, leveling up our competition. And from our close qualifiers are 2 CIS teams who managed to take the spots, and they are the rising VIRTUS.PRO and FORZE. So very competitive format here. A lot of changes made to our lineups of our partner teams as well. We will be playing GSL groups. The top 2 teams will automatically qualify for our playoffs. We will end with last chance qualifiers to qualify our final 2 teams, and then we will head into double elimination in our last 8 teams. These are our groups. So our group stage, GSL format, double elimination here as well. All matches will be best of 3, and we will be with FNATIC, Contact, DIGNITAS, and Mad Lions in one of our groups as we go through these rosters. So starting off, taking a look at these teams, and we'll get some quick points here from our analysts about these groups and who we think is going to come out on top. But let's go through our lineups one by one first, right? And let's start with one of our invited teams, which will be FNATIC. Your thoughts? Easily one of the favorites coming into this tournament.
Yeah, not only actually have they started to rediscover some of that form that they were so good with earlier in the year, but more importantly, like, these are household names. I mean, some of these guys have won multiple majors. Interestingly enough, they've managed to rotate around. So the star now is the young guy on the left, Brawler, but the veterans still play their role. Crim's super steady. What do you think?
I've certainly felt from watching FNATIC recently that Flusher's been in really great form recently, despite everything being online. So for me, coming into this tournament, he is really in the running for me to be one of the absolute best players. So throughout, Flusher for me will definitely be a player to keep my eye on.
Yeah, and we've talked to a couple of their players, JW and Golden, on our Flashpoint Q&A. They have mentioned that they've struggled more than they would have liked during the online era compared to what they expect from themselves in terms of LAN play. So we'll be seeing if they can make that rebound and maybe take first place here at Flashpoint. Moving right along, we have one of our partner teams, which will be Contact. They've had some roster movements as of recently and have settled finally on Spinks and Rigon here, who are coming in as new players to this roster. You know, they did have Smooya in there for a while. They were, I think, quite underwhelming during Flashpoint 1. What do you make of these changes and additions?
It's a kind of more the same, but with a different lineup, in the sense that they've got the talent there, the pieces where if it all went great, they all could find their role. They could be dangerous, could be a dark horse team, but Snappy has got his work cut out for him. He's going to have to really corral these guys, figure out roles for people who've never really had proper roles. Like, I think this is a tough one. I don't see them doing that well, personally.
Yeah, certainly for me, with Esperanto, Rigon, and Spinks, they're all, certainly Rigon and Spinks, super inexperienced. Esperanto, he's still very much figuring out the team game. So for me, if Snappy can actually pull it off for this team and really put out great results, it'll be incredible for his resume as an in-game leader.
And moving right along to Dignitas, another team that has taken the route of some rising players here in Europe. Dignitas Vi coming in, and they made some big moves away from the old NIP roster. So Exist and Get Right, who played on this roster during Flashpoint 1, no longer there. Instead, Halzerk will be here this time. Wasn't able to play. Guardian was standing in last time around. And we have Heath and Harry as well. What do you guys think of these new changes and of the removal of these longtime stars?
The tough part about this lineup is you want to encourage teams to not just stick with a lot of recycled talent, a lot of veterans that aren't top level. But when you say that, you want them to bring in the hot new player, the next rising star. And unfortunately, the hype behind the scenes hasn't been that these guys they brought in are going to be the next brawler and the next sick player. So I think those players are going to have a lot of pressure playing with the legends. And generally, this team, they've done nothing this year, even in Flashpoint 1. So I know they had a stand in then, but for me, if this doesn't work at Flashpoint 2, it's a failed project.
So yeah, certainly with this Dignitas team, a change has been made. The old lineup, sticking to very much the old NIP core, was never going to work, and even the style they were playing was never going to fit with modern Counter-Strike. So in that sense, they moved away from that old lineup. Definitely a good move, but I think for both of us, definitely the players they brought in feel a bit underwhelming, and perhaps throughout the tournament, hopefully we can see kind of their logic behind the moves and why they went for these players.
Yeah, another thing we have to consider as well is that Freiburg is moving into that IGL role now that Exist is no longer on the roster. He has had this role at times in the past, and from our conversations with him, seems quite confident, but that'll be another thing to take a look at here. Now, to our final team in this Midsummer group, it will be Mad Lions, our defending Flashpoint champion, but big moves within this roster. Before Flashpoint 1, they kicked Hunden, put in Asilian as the IGL. Now, Asilian has left this roster, and so has Bubsky as he made his move over to the Astralis bench. And Refresh and Hooksy are now on this roster. Hooksy serving the IGL role coming in from Copenhagen Flames. So big mix-up here in terms of that IGL. How is it going to affect Mad Lions' ability to defend this title?
The tough thing is the field was a lot weaker at Flashpoint 1, and I actually think Mad Lions is in worse shape than they were coming in Flashpoint 1, because at the time, even the rough edges you saw as like, well, that's something that the learning curve, they'll get in there, they'll get better. They did improve as the tournament went on. For me, Bobsky was the best player overall. Bit contentious because a lot of people like A-Core, and I liked Asilian's game. I thought he was actually fitting the team, but I understand with the other results why they've made the move. I just think this is a big gamble and right before one of the biggest tournaments of the year.
So with this team, obviously the thing that people are focusing the most on is Hooksy coming in, Asilian going out. But for me, the biggest change for a player here is Refresh. His roles have totally changed. He's having to be a more passive player on T side particularly. And for me, that doesn't fit with how I think of Refresh as a player. So certainly here and in these first games particularly, it'll be really interesting for me to see how he copes with those roles and how he copes with being more passive playing the late round, when for me, that's probably his weakest areas as a player.
And as we come in here, we do name all of our groups at Flashpoint. We have designated this group as Midsummer. Reason why? Well, it's a bunch of Scandinavians killing each other, but also there's some non-Scandinavians being killed potentially by the Scandinavians as well. Contact, I think, the victim potentially in this group so far. Let's look very quickly at who you think are going to be the top two. Who is definitely emerging from this group into our playoff positions and why?
So with this group, there's no doubt that FNATIC are going to make it out. I'd be gobsmacked, to be honest, if they didn't place first in this group. Second place is more debatable, but I am fairly sure it will be Mad Lions in this group. I don't think the Dignitas lineup is going to perform particularly well, and with Contact, they've just got so many issues with new players at the moment, and I really don't think they're going to be able to overcome it.
Yeah, for me, I'm not really counting Dig right now. They have to show me something. Contact has the skills to do it, but I think with the double limb, best of three, I favour Mad Lions, because I think part of why they've gambled on the Hooksy Refresh, who also played in past teams, including at Flashpoint 1 and Copenhagen Flames, is they're going for structure again. So I expect them to actually come in with a decent team setup, and so I can't really gamble on the uncertainties of Contact right now.
Fair enough. And we are going to move on now straight to our group that is playing today and will be in our first and second matches of the day. And that will be Big, MIBR, Envy, and FORZE. Lots of interesting storylines here, especially with MIBR's recent, very strong performance. We're going to see the debut of Envy's new roster in our first match today. So this is a team that we've been seeing not that much from overall when it comes to MIBR. And they're going up against one of the top teams so far in 2020 in this online pandemic era, which is Big. So let's talk about Big. Many people would say they are the absolute favorites of the tournament, Flashpoint 2 coming in. Do you guys agree, and what is their strength right now?
So for me, Big are the favourite to win the tournament. I think from all angles, I think they have the best structure. I think their in-game leading from tabseN is really phenomenal, especially for a player that hasn't always been in the in-game leader role. And looking at the rest of the field, I just think they're just so much more complete than the rest of the teams. That's really the word I would emphasise for Big versus the other teams. Because even a team like FNATIC, which is obviously the other team you'd put in the running, I don't think they're as complete as Big, and that's why, for me, I would take Big to win this tournament.
Yeah, the key as well is, like, they have, as he says, they're so well-rounded, they have it everywhere. They're tactically probably the best team in the tournament. Firepower, we know when Xantares and tabseN are on their game. If SyrsoN adds anything, very few teams can match that trio. And then people forget the actual supportive elements, people like Tizzy and people like Keto, they've basically slotted into the team. You can see where the spirit of God B lives on in structuring the team. So I think they've got the map pool, they've won the tournaments already. I think, if anything, the fact that they've had a little bit of a dip coming into this tournament, they should be very motivated to try and win this kind of prize money.
And their opponent is going to be a bit of a surprise here in MIBR, a team that has pushed Astralis to the brink recently in other tournaments. We've also seen them overcome their Brazilian rivals in Furia. So big surprises. And I think the question here that we have to ask is this roster, was it a lack of film that caught these teams by surprise? How tactically deep are they? Because they have come out extremely strong.
So for me, I was very surprised while watching MIBR playing in the Blast group stage tournament. I didn't have high expectations for them. I didn't really know anything about the additional players beyond Lucas they brought in. But for me, they're playing really good Counter-Strike for the amount of practice they have. And the most impressive thing for me about MIBR is that they are playing to win. They don't have the structure, they don't have the depth, but they're playing the contact plays. They're running the 4-1s, and with the tools they have available, they're really, they're here to put in results, even if potentially people are sleeping on them right now.
Yeah, my problem is I actually think that they sort of peaked a bit early by having that Blast group, which they were in contention to maybe get out of it, which should have been impossible. So the thing is, that's when they came in as the black box experiment. No one knew what the practice was, what maps do they like, how do they play. There is some material now, and also I just think some of that felt like a Cinderella story. I don't know if some of those players can play to that level. They were playing some of the best players in the world. So I think at this tournament, listen, in this group, they've got chances, but I don't have them as a favorite.
Yeah, it's also, I think, like there was a lack of film previously. Maybe the other teams weren't taking them as seriously with this new roster. Now the other teams are going to be able to do their research, and it's going to be tough for them to beat Dig. Moving right along, we're going to talk about our first match of the day here. It will be Envy versus FORZE. So Team Envy, they have been boot camping for the last month here in Europe, but they have played no events. So we are going to get the first look at this new Envy lineup, including Thomas, a rising UK star, Legia returning to a player position after being in that coaching role. Is this the roster that can finally click for Envy? Do they have the firepower necessary?
So I actually really like this roster, and I think the main aspect that draws me to liking this roster is the roles. I think they're really well defined in this team, where you've got Legia and Thomas are going to be the more supportive elements. I'm expecting them on CT side to be the anchors, and then on T side defaulting to the sides of the map. And you've got the heavy hitters, Mihu, Calix. Maybe don't have the best decision making, but in terms of raw individual skill, they can go up against anyone in this tournament. So for me, the roles on this team make a lot of sense. The big question mark is Calling and then Nifty's individual level. But if those areas can be cleared up, they could easily get out this group, and they could go decently far in this tournament.
Yeah, the trouble for me is people will forget the roster was slightly different in Flashpoint 1, where they were nowhere close to even being competitive. So the key thing is, it's about how those supportive elements in the structure elevates the stars. Because I know that if Calix scores off, he has some really good mechanical skill. Like, he could be a sleeper MVP of the tournament. If he does, then Envy can be a playoff team, then they can contend with people, they can make these best of threes interesting. For now, I think they come in as kind of an uncertain quality. I think even in this group, I'm not sure I have them getting out. So I think they're borderline. They're maybe one of those teams that might be a last chance qualifier team.
Yeah, well, we'll see, because they certainly have been putting the effort in when it comes to practice. They have been here for an extended period of time. And even before that, Nifty was playing on ping with this roster all the way from Dallas in America. So interesting to see where they come through. Now we're going to move on to our final team in this group, and it will be FORZE, one of our closed qualifier teams coming from the CIS region. And what are your thoughts on this team? Because they've had a bit of an uneven performance as of late in some of the CIS-only tournaments that we've seen over on the IEM ESL side.
Certainly, I think their inconsistency is totally intrinsic to their style. The way they play the game, they don't have the team fundamentals that you see in the top European teams. Their calling is not at the same level of, in a FNATIC, Astralis, these sort of teams big as well at the moment. So for them, they just don't have the depth, they don't have the structure to have consistency. That's why we see them at some tournaments, they just frag it out, they front run it, and they can win the tournament, they can get, top placings, but equally they can bomb out in last place if everything isn't clicking. And you even hear rumors in the team where, players aren't interacting correctly, there's personality problems, comms are probably all over the place, to be honest. So I'm really not sure what to expect from FORZE in this tournament, and it'll be really interesting to see going forward how they approach this tournament. Can they bring the consistency that perhaps we haven't seen in the past?
See, the weird thing is, though, I actually think of the CIS leaders, especially the ones without a massive reputation, Jerry's actually doing a pretty decent job. He's crafted his own style. Plus, we know they're doing their demo research. They're watching all the opponents. They're figuring out all the stack. But the problem is this. There's a style of scouting the opponent where, yeah, you're using it to make decisions as to what you want to do. But I see FORZE as like a brute force team. Like, even when they find the angle when they want to go, they just hit it like it's a brick wall. Like, they just try and smash their way through. So if that works, and especially if a team isn't prepared for it, you can expect a very explosive game. But I think some of the teams, maybe not all the teams in their group, there's a style that counters that can make that very ineffective and can really frustrate the CIS squad. So being underdogs, they're really going to have to, I think, get wins early to have the confidence to even think they can get somewhere in this tournament.
And getting the wins early might be tough because there's no film on this new Envy roster at all. So the preparation is going to be tough. Envy coming in certainly with an informational advantage in our first map. All right, so this is going to be our group here, and we have named this group Demolition Men. Fantastic movie with Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. If you haven't seen it, it's a good old classic.
It was a brilliant anti-hero that broke all the rules. But enough about FORZE.
Exactly. Certainly, I think many of you will be getting that reference. And as we clip along here, let's take a look at our final group here in Flashpoint 2 that will be competing over the next couple of weeks. And it will be OG, one of our invited teams, GEN.G, a partner team, Cloud9 with their fancy new Henry G and Kassad-led roster, and VIRTUS.PRO, a CIS team certainly on the rise these days. Now, I would say this is probably our most competitive group, the most difficult one to predict overall. So let's head in straight to some of the rosters, starting with OG, one of the presumptive favorites here in Flashpoint 2.
For a field like this, in theory, OG have everything you want. They've got the established veterans who've been to the top, done it with different teams. They've got young talent that's pretty good. They've even got the person who could develop in Issa. Maybe he's going to get his shit together. The problem they've had overall, though, is most of the year was a struggle. They famously were the people who were like, we almost did it. We were almost a winner, but almost doesn't count in Counter-Strike. So the interesting thing for me is they have turned the corner the last 2 months, basically, and now they're actually getting those finishes. They're winning the close games. They're winning their own map, which used to be a problem. So I see it actually as they're one of the teams that's peaking at the right time. I could see them winning this tournament.
Really? Well, for me, even though they've been a team...
You sound incredulous.
Yeah, for me, like if I had to pick a team that was most likely to underwhelm, I think it would probably be OG. And the reason is, even though they've been a lineup for a year now, I still think they have pretty bad communication issues from what I can see from their games. And I also think that Alexi B can really struggle mid-rounding at times. And these are really big problems. You do not fix these overnight. And I just don't see them overcoming these issues fast enough to put in, a result that could really challenge a big or FNATIC and take this tournament.
And now we've got another one of our American teams, which will be GEN.G. Now, they are going to be fielding a couple of substitutes in this roster in C.R.A.E and Exist. So we had seen, compared to our last Flashpoint, Daps and Som depart to go join a Valorant team. And so they come into this without an IGL. Potentially Exist is filling that role. We've also heard that Kusta might be taking that position for the team. This is obviously going to be tough because they haven't had a lot of time to practice together. What are the bright spots that we can look forward to when it comes to GEN.G?
So, assuming Kusta is calling, which isn't 100% certain, but I would say it probably is, the one thing that they can take away from this tournament is really testing him in that in-game leader position, getting some experience. I mean, you can scrim all you like, but getting real match experience, nothing compares to that. So for them, That's the biggest thing they can take away from this tournament, getting Kuster up to speed, see if it works, and then potentially even informing future roster moves. Do we have to get an in-game leader? Do we have to, break a contract to get someone? So for me, that's what I'll be watching. Even if the team isn't functioning on a whole level, is Kuster making good calls? Is he setting up the team well?
Yeah, the issue is, if this was a normal weekend tournament like we get 1 billion of in Counter-Strike, I would say make exist the IGL. Just do a loose style, frag out, basically. You know it's never going to be a real roster. But bearing in mind, we've got almost a month here to play.
Sure.
You're going to have a down week for the playoffs. If anything, try and see if this real core can work, and then in the future we'll add the other players in, because at the moment I feel like Gen.G, this has been quite an underwhelming year. They had a couple of highs earlier on. Flashpoint 1 wasn't one. So if at the 2 biggest tournaments of the year you don't make a deep run, you haven't really got an impact on the championship, you have to reconsider a lot about the roster at that point in time.
Yeah, and as we move on to our next team, it will be Cloud9, one of the most hyped teams in terms of this new roster building. Up there, certainly with Nico going to G2 recently. This roster has been formed by former caster and our friend and colleague, Mr. Henry Greer, and Kassad, longtime coach of 100 Thieves and Renegades before that. So, Cloud9, they kept Floppy on this roster that we saw at Flashpoint 1, but everyone else is new. They picked up probably the hottest IGL free agent in Alex, and they've been building this team according to a methodology. Does this roster do it for you guys? Is it clear what everyone's role is? Who are going to be the stars here?
So in terms of the stars, for me, it's definitely going to be Woxic, but there is a real question over even just talking in game, who's going to be playing the rotator spots. I'm not sure who's going to be the more supportive players. The anchors defaulting to the sides of the map on T side. So there's so many questions in this team. I think the player I draw attention to is actually Woxic, because we know he's phenomenally skilled. In times of mouse sports, big lands, he's performed at absolutely the highest level. But obviously, since the pandemic, he hasn't had the same results. You could speculate motivation problems, this sort of stuff. There's obviously something going on within mouse sports with the way he got removed. So coming into this team, for him, I really hope it, re-sparks the motivation, because Woxic, he can be the best AWPer in this tournament if he really comes on form.
Yeah, I actually agree. If you're doing the traditional structure that I set up in Counter-Strike, where you've got your first star and your second star, and then the others shake up depending on the structure, the problem is, actually, I think fans will get lost, and they'll think the second star is going to be S-Tag, because they saw him in Astralis, he was having big numbers. He's also, by the way, I think the highest paid Counter-Strike player in the entire world. The thing is, though, I think him and Mezzi will be the more supportive elements. I think that's the whole point of the team. You've got the veteran guy, you've got the younger guy. I think a lot of this is on Floppy. The reason you bring that guy in, he was the main star of Cloud9. He had them on his back sometimes. So, in my opinion, if you keep him going, he's already in decent form. You get Woxic back online with the AWP, then you've got some structure behind it, and, in my opinion, one of the most underrated in-game leaders. I think Alex can still do a lot. I think people will find out that just because Vitality got back to the top without him, he was an integral part. They did it a different way this time around. So, I think this is a team where this is a sleeper to potentially win the tournament.
Yeah, and they have been practicing. They did have a boot camp in Serbia starting before the tournament to get to know each other a bit better in person before heading back to their homes in order to play this event. And I agree. I think Floppy, this is his big chance to show that he can be an international level star after being a big fish in a small pond on the former Cloud9 roster. Our final team here in Flashpoint is going to be VIRTUS.PRO, a team that is really contending for top of the heap in the CIS region right now, taking down Na'Vi recently in impressive fashion. Is this a team that can possibly even go all the way here?
If you look at the results alone, beating Na'Vi in 2 best-of-3s is what they did in that tournament. That's no joke. Na'Vi, they might not be in their best form, but you don't beat Na'Vi twice in best-of-3s unless you're doing something right. So clearly, there are aspects of this team that are good, but for me, from watching them, their overall game doesn't make complete sense. And what we talked about earlier with Big being a super complete team, and even FNATIC, they cover a lot of the areas. This is one of the teams, they're very linear. They can only do certain things really well, and then if you take them out of their comfort zone, they have real problems. They can't fall back on the structure that another team possibly could. So for me, I'm really not sure what to expect from this team. And again, like I said, for FORZE, I could see it going either way. They could come up, they could punch in great results, they could equally, fall apart. I'm not really sure what to expect.
What is crazy about this lineup is, first of all, they're very set in their ways how they want to play Counter-Strike. They think they've just essentially discovered the real meta that's on the side that we just don't understand in Europe. And so it's bizarre because they essentially were in hibernation, it felt like, since the last major. So I guess they only get up for the big money tournaments. That's when they just go, right, time to actually do something, time to work now, because the form coming into this tournament from the Flashpoint qualifier and the other qualifiers in that region onwards, they're beating almost everyone. They've beaten Na'Vi a whole bunch of times. So, like, you can see, if you could beat Na'Vi, that's a very skilled team. Like, you can't trip over and do that. There's something to their style of play. The problem is, I'm actually a big skeptic, not only of James, of his opening style. I even think they don't set up. I think the best player in the team is Boston, and they don't even seem to actually play around him. So they're a team where they have their own vision of the game. And listen, I'll accept there's other ways of thinking about the game, but if you disagree with me, you must show me results.
Fair enough. And so we get to the name of this group, which will be a literary reference out there. We do like to educate you just a little bit. Going back to the Bible, it will be the Tower of Babel. We have so many languages, so many nationalities represented in this group. And of course, some of them are going to be arrogant enough that they try and build a structure to reach godhood, right? So
yes.
There you go. Who is going to actually successfully reach heaven without being smote by lightning? And who will be? Who are the top 2 teams that you think are going to qualify for our playoffs from our Tower of Babel group?
Well, the interesting thing is it is the most stacked group, but because of these factors, like the sheer number of, like, some of the teams have players from all over the place and they haven't been so coherent, I think this is a real tough one to claim. Like, I actually look at the group, like I said, I think OG can potentially be a champ, so I'm going to take them to get out overall. The second one, I still feel like I have to put some faith in Cloud9 because, like, just the players on paper, if they can all come at the levels I've seen at, even in the last year, they can potentially be very dangerous. The other ones, like Gen.G, I can't expect anything from, and VP, I just think the gimmick's going to run out eventually.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I mean, within this group, let's be realistic, Gen.G, 2 stand-ins. You know, I don't think they're going to be getting out in this group. But beyond them, the other 3 teams totally wide open. I could see any of them winning this group. And obviously with Cloud9, we haven't even seen them play yet, so it's so hard to quantify which way they're going to go. I think if I had to put my money where my mouth is, I probably would take OG to win the group. But that second spot, I could see it easily going either way.
The good news is, though, remember, the format, because a third-place team can play the last chance qualifier match, let's say Cloud9 only comes third or VIRTUS.PRO looks good but comes third, they can still potentially be in the playoffs and make an impact.
And also, we will have one 4th-place team in the last chance qualifier as well. So if these matches end up being extremely close, with each team taking maps off of each other, and those maps themselves in terms of rounds are quite close, we could definitely end up, with a 4th-place team coming in and snagging a spot in the playoffs. So that is going to do it for our group overview. Thank you very much. We are going to be back to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at our first match here, which will be between Envy and FORZE right after the break.
After the break,
Team Envy
versus FORZE. Stay tuned for what again? Stay tuned in Flashpoint 2.
Our first match here at Flashpoint 2 will be our reveal of the brand new Envy roster. Very exciting. It's been months since we've seen an Envy game played, but they have been doing a lot in that time. We've had Envy playing from Texas during the pandemic on what he told us was about 120 ping. He was pretty cool about it, didn't seem to mind. Read into that what you will about him and his ability to hit those shots. But all the same, he's been here in London now for a month, practicing with this brand new roster. And so we've got a lot of interesting stories to discuss there. First off, let's take a look at our teams in this group that we will be playing today. So it is the Demolition Men group, and we'll be waiting on that graphic in just a second. So first off, let's talk about Envy. We glossed over them just a little bit. You guys really think it's up to the fragging power of Mihu and Calyx in order to carry this roster. We didn't see that necessarily coming into Flashpoint 1, but it should be a much more comfortable experience with more practice here at Flashpoint 2.
They did also, to be fair, they had their own stand-in situation at Flashpoint 1, and then I think like someone went home and was on a higher ping or something.
Yeah, they were playing with Moose, who was in Canada, and yeah, there were a lot of complications.
So I don't necessarily judge them on Flashpoint 1, but the problem is, what do I have to judge them on since then? They've barely played any online competitions. It wasn't with this lineup either. Legia was the coach at the time. So I will just say it frankly, I know they claim to be confident, but I look at this lineup and I say, you just cobbled this together at the last minute. So even if they've had a boot camp, I think they have some decent pieces. I actually kind of agree. The roles aren't terrible. It's just, like, what have I got to be confident about? Like, even in this group, I feel like some of the other, like even FORZE, I think matches up pretty well with them. I'm actually surprised that the odds were kind of so skewed in that sense. So I feel like there is going to be a lot of pressure on Nifty. He's been the IGL of this team for many years now. Everyone else has swapped around him, and he remains. Eventually, you've got to ask a question about whether you're the through line in some of the problems. And like I said, I think Mihu and Calyx are both good players, but they're players you've got to very specifically use if you want them to be good. They're not just players you turn loose and they just do whatever they want themselves. So I think thus far, like, Calyx hasn't really ever played Counter-Strike in this structured sense, and Mihu, he just hasn't even been good in enough teams. I actually think he's a legit player.
Alan, tell me about your British countryman Thomas and why we should be excited about watching him play now in this new Envy roster.
So for me, the most exciting thing about Thomas isn't necessarily that he's going to come in and be a star fragger, have incredible mechanical ability. For me, the biggest positives with a player like Thomas is, first of all, he's played so many roles on these previous teams. He's done pretty much everything. So coming into this one, I'm definitely expecting him to be more of a supportive sort of player. And from what he said in interviews, that definitely seems to be the case. For Thomas, the best things to hear about are definitely things outside of the server. Mentality, communication, all of these sort of things, potentially what we've lacked in the UK over the last few years for sure. So for Thomas, he really does need to be kind of a really supportive element for this team. Potentially the comms might be an issue at the start. So for them, they need stable pieces, and hopefully Thomas can bring that for them.
Since we haven't seen this roster, let's talk about what you guys think their ceiling and floor is. If everything comes together for Envy, what do you think is the top placement you could see here at Flashpoint 2, and what is the absolute worst they could do if they bomb out?
I actually don't think this team has even a chance to win. Like, I think a really good performance for them would be to come like 4th, 5th to 6th. That's if, like, as I say, Calyx is a near MVP, Mihu works, Thomas is integrated, doesn't have any nerves, everything basically goes well. I could see the ceiling being the absolute bottom. They could, if everything goes really badly, they could be the worst team, or they could be a team that barely limps into that last chance qualifier. I think the variance can be high, but I actually would put it more towards the ladder. I think they're going to be a team that barely makes playoffs.
Yeah, with this team, it's the same with Cloud9, actually. There's just so many questions with a new lineup. You don't really know how anything's going to interact. I mean, even prepping for this, you have no idea which roles players are going to be taking. So in that sense, it could just be a disaster. They've never played a match at all. So for them, I have no idea what to expect. They probably don't know what to expect. And there's so many questions, even for things like map pool. What are they going to pick into? What are they going to ban? I'm not sure they even know what they're strong on, because, in scrims, you can, destroy people on the map. You go into an official, it falls apart. This player's not as confident. This team play isn't as good. And the comms are crap and it doesn't work. So for them, there's so many questions to figure out, and they're going to have to figure them out really fast if they want to even reach, top 4 like we were talking about.
Fair enough. Let's move on to FORZE and talk about this roster, because we're going from extreme to extreme here. Team with absolutely no film. Team where Jerry told us in a Flashpoint Q&A that FORZE has played 2,000 games of Counter-Strike Counter-Strike this year alone. So just an absolute unending supply of film on this FORZE roster. So we have a much better idea of what to expect. And what do you expect?
Well, this is where, actually, the point that Alan made about Nifty and what they will do and if they'll have the roles correct, you'll see it in this first game, because the key thing about FORZE is they don't seem to mind that there are a billion demos out there that you can watch them, because they still play the same style every time, no matter what the opponent is. So for me, it's all about the firepower on FORZE. That's what I want to see. Like, one aspect I found very interesting when I was digging into it is everyone's seen the highlights, especially some of the CT halves he's had, of Exapower, the AWPer. A lot of people wanted him to potentially go to Na'Vi. Obviously, it was actually Flip that was the one that was rumored to go there. But when I looked into it, like, I've seen the highlights and he looks good, but the test for me with an AWPer is, if you have that gun every round, and you have it on the rounds where you're not having a great game, what can you do with it? Can you only peek a corner and hit a shot? Can you create map pressure? Can you rotate correctly? And I found something very interesting I had our stats guys looking into, which is Exapower is unusually emphasizing the AWP. Most AWPers, they have like at least some element of a hybrid game. They'll play a rifle, especially on certain maps. This guy, essentially, he has something like 20 times more AWP kills than AK kills in the last 3 months. So that effectively means he has been force-fed the AWP at all times. He is using it on every side of the map. And also, I'll add in as well, like, he did have pretty high kills with it. So essentially, like, his whole game is AWPing. If he doesn't have an AWP in his hands, if you can keep AWP out of his hands, if you can keep their economy limited, I think the chances of FORZE winning go really down.
And let's take a look now at our actual map pick and veto so we can describe whether those necessities for FORZE are going to come into play here, especially on some of those maps with longer sight lines. So as we come in here and take a look at our bans and
we obviously
picks,
have no idea for Envy, but the classic almost perma for the guys from FORZE is Vertigo. If someone else already vetoed that, they maybe go overpass, but I would expect they do Vertigo now. I mean, if I'm Envy, I'd even probably practice that on the side in the hopes that maybe they gamble and don't do it. Now for the picks, on Envy's side, again, you don't really technically know where they're going to go. You haven't seen them play, you don't know this lineup.
Well, yeah, for me, when we were thinking about this team coming in and what they said in interviews, they've always said, we're going to be a really tactical team, we have super good structure. So looking at this team, you're thinking train nuke, they're going to go into this. So even looking at these bans already, this train ban is really disappointing, because especially for them, FORZE are not a good train team. And if they picked into train, they stand a really good chance, assuming they have the practice on it and all that. So even already, this is quite disappointing for me. And hopefully going into the picks, they can pick into something where FORZE are quite weak.
Now, this in itself is actually, I guess this actually says something, in my opinion, about either how they see FORZE or what little practice they've had. Because going to Dust 2, again, don't brag about being super tactical and all the rest of it, and then just pick Dust 2 against this team. It's not even like FORZE is totally terrible on it, but certainly not necessarily a FORZE specialty. So to me, maybe it's cockiness that we actually think they're overrated, or they're just, I mean, it is an online tournament, but they're small minnows, as it were. Remember, the classic thing about Dust 2 is unless you're really good on it, unless the opponent has some weakness, you are always opening the door that they frag out. Maybe my boy Exapower goes off with those force-fed AWPs, and his appetite is unyielding and they win that map. So the danger here is, what is the pick going to be over on the side of FORZE? Because traditionally, it's always Mirage or Inferno. In this case, they pick Mirage. Now, I will say, to be fair, you've sort of done a gentleman's agreement. Let's just play the two fragging maps, sir, and see who is the best at fragging. Because it's certainly a FORZE map, but Envy not only played it with the old lineup, but everyone plays Mirage.
So if you're coming into this series and you were saying, okay, we're expecting Envy to be the super tactical team, super structured team, we're expecting FORZE to be the looser, they play off the individuals, and you told me the first two maps with Gust 2 and Mirage, you just be, what is happening? How could you get in this veto position?
But, I mean, there could be a different layer to this. To give Envy the benefit of the doubt, right? If they think that they can just straight up out-frag FORZE, maybe they save some of their tactics for tougher opponents.
I don't think, listen, I'd like to see tactics before I see saving tactics. What is it? Is Jamie IGL a FORZE? Envy,
hey, I'm just playing devil's advocate here for you guys.
And the tough thing about this is as well, the reason why I don't like the Mirage pick is because, like I say, I'm almost certain Envy's going to have the basics of that map down. But meanwhile, you've now allowed them to ban your Inferno. That is a go-to map if you're the guys from FORZE. The map you always want to play. I even think the gimmicks on that map are good. Now, traditionally, they like a bit of nuke. They've been known to play some of that. They used to ban overpass. So with what's left, basically, it should be nuke as the last pick.
Yeah, it should definitely be a slam dunk here to go for overpass. Is the third. I've watched actually a little bit of them on nuke. They're pretty good on nuke of FORZE. And as we can see, they've done exactly what we haven't said and go straight for nuke as the third. And So coming into this one, when we did our predictions, which we might talk about in a minute, I went for Envy with the odds that we've been provided, and seeing this veto, it's too late to change my mind, but
it is.
I'm much more doubting myself now I've seen this veto coming out of the mix.
I actually think it's a slightly more Forza-favoured veto, yes.
Yeah. So as we review this, how do you think these maps are going to break down? We have two very puggy maps followed by a very tactical map in Nuke. It is kind of a bizarre splits between those two halves. So what about you guys in terms of, do you think we're going to even hit Nuke here, or do you think one team is going to overwhelm in terms of that firepower and come away with the 2-0?
Well, obviously, without seeing Envy play at all, it's very hard to say. From watching Forza on Dust 2, they're not a particularly good team. I think they struggle a lot with long control on the CT side. So certainly from Envy's perspective, they have a long spawns, take it every single time, try and just open up the map. So hopefully we can see that from Envy. And from what I remember of Forza on the CT side, this is a map where if you have poor rotations, if you make weird mid-round decisions, particularly positioning, you can get punished big time on CT Dust 2 because of those mid doors. If Envy get mid control, if they get out there, they get players lurking out, they can cut off the rotates, and it could really fall apart for Forza. So I'm not totally against the Dust 2 pick. I would have gone in a different direction, but assuming they've done their preparation, it could go well for them, but again, I'm not really sure what to expect from Envy here.
I don't like, as I said, basically giving them an in if you force to the Envy guys on Mirage, because it means there's a world where you get 2-0'd, and I think that is how I will structure this. If Envy wins, they will 2-0 the first two maps and probably win convincingly. The thing that does work on the flip side of that is, what you're basically seeing if you Forza is, at least we have the insurance policy. Nuke is there as the third map. If they get to Nuke, I actually see that being pretty strong for them. So if it's 3 maps, I'd say Forza. I overall picked Envy because of the odds.
Well, let's take a look at a couple of players here to start off, because we need to keep an eye on some individual performances. You name-checked him earlier. Thorin, Exapower, maybe being the X factor here on the side of Force. And Calix, wanting to live up to his fragging reputation and potential here on this new look Envy roster.
So with Calix, I think when we saw him in Space Soldiers, he just looked like such a phenomenally individually skilled player. Obviously, we always had Xantares on the lineup, so he's always kind of, in the shadow of him. But coming into this lineup, you expect him to be potentially the best player on this team. You need monster halves from him, especially, we're bringing in Thomas and Legia. These are not going to be high fragging players compared to some of the best players in the world and all of this. So with Calix, from what I've seen of him so far, he's still lacking the team game knowledge, and he's still on that transition from Space Soldiers. They're a much looser team. They play much more on the fly. The comms are probably a bit all over the place. And coming into this team, especially now they've got Cuban and his coach, Leggy is in the lineup, he really needs to nail down these fundamentals if Calix is going to grow into kind of the star that I feel, in a sense, we've actually been waiting for a while with this Envy team, even with the previous lineup.
Yeah, and the key thing is I'm putting a lot of that pressure on Legia and on Nifty, because listen, you guys brought him in because you thought he had the talent. You saw that Xantares had similar problems initially in Big, but now they've made him one of the best players in all of Europe. So let's see what you can do with this guy. He needs to be your best player. Otherwise, what's the point in having him in the team if he's not a team player? And then on the Exapower side of things, especially against lower-level competition like Envy, a dominant CT AWPer can just essentially crush the T game. Like, that can actually just win you rounds that you didn't have any counters for. You wouldn't have never won the retake. You wouldn't have done smart rotations. It cannot matter if the AWPer's hitting his shots. So you know he's going to get his AWPs. Let's see what you can actually do with them.
Fair enough. Any other additional players you guys would like to call out that you in particular want to keep a closer eye on as we go into first map here?
I would just say, like, the obvious angle people would go with his flip, because, like, why would Na'Vi want this guy if he wasn't a tremendously skilled player? But I actually think Jerry's an interesting angle, because even though it's an IGL, I think it's kind of there a little bit and not so much in the entire game. He's actually a pretty decent fragger for an IGL, actually. When he goes in first on some of these rounds to set them up, like, he'll get the kills as well. Like, he's not a guy who's running in just to die and be bait for someone. So I actually think he's a bit unique in that regard.
So with the Envy side, I know we've spoken a bit about him already, but Nifty is definitely the player to watch here. And on a map like Dust 2, where there are limited options for, like, CT information plays, making pushes, he needs to be everywhere. And my biggest criticism for Nifty on the previous Envy lineup, way too static, way too standard. And now when we're hearing potentially rumors of Legia taking on more of the calling role, hopefully, in that sense, you can free up Nifty a bit more. And coming into this game, in this series, we need to see Nifty being more mobile. We need to see him all over the map. And hopefully, if he does that, they could have a much stronger CT side on Dust 2.
Well, let's take a look at the odds. We are about to get into our first map here of Flashpoint 2. Our odds are provided by our partner over at Pinnacle. So it looks like we have a big favorite here in FORZE. So 1.42 to 2.9. Envy coming in with no tape on them as a pretty significant underdog. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
I mean, I kind of what you just said. When you've got all the form, when you've had a little spike, like you wouldn't even be in this tournament if you hadn't beaten quality sides. Like Gambit was no joke. They were on a nice little streak themselves at one point in time. No one knows what to expect of Envy. I will say, like, I don't know when we do the predictions, but this is a thing that we've actually changed about how we're doing. We're not just predicting the winner of the game. We're also basically selecting it based on some of the odds as well. So we're trying to actually figure out ourselves, how does that amplify or change what you think in terms of the results? So I think it's a fairly even match overall. So for me, as a result, I thought, well, I'll take Envy on this one.
Yeah, I certainly agree coming into this one. This is really, in my head, at least before seeing the veto, a really 55-45 sort of matchup. So with odds like this, where it's 3-1 for Envy to win, that for me is a bit out of whack. I wouldn't have gone that far towards FORZE. Potentially they'd be a favourite. But again, with our predictions where we're doing them scaled with the odds, I went for Envy to win this game because of those odds, and hopefully they show up in the points at the end of the day. Otherwise, we'll be doing the forfeits in the end.
And to describe how we're operating predictions here this time around for everybody with Pinnacle, we've been giving each of our casters and analysts 1,000 Pinnacle points a day that they can allocate between the two matches with a minimum of 250 on each, and those will be multiplied by our odds, and we will have a leaderboard with that up and coming for you guys later today to show how our predictions are doing. So as we head into that, just remember that the predictions may not be on who they think is going to be the winner, but if they really like those odds on an underdog, maybe they'll put a few of their Pinnacle points over there instead and try and hit it big.
And it's worth pointing out, you have to spend all 1,000 a day. You can't be like Anders and just hoard all your wealth like Smaug in your caves. They don't pass over the next day.
All right, let's take a look at our fan odds next, guys. We have been taking your votes. Surprising to see 54%. A lot of Envy fans really believing in this new roster compared to the 46% over for FORZE right now. Maybe we just haven't hit that Russian audience quite yet.
It's also just a feel-good story of FORZE lose at the moment. Keeping up with the community, anyone?
That's true. There may be some bias. There may be some bias due to recent actions, which don't have anything to do with the coach and players of this this specific roster that are going to be playing in Flashpoint. But the sentiment may not be riding high with them, as it were, right now.